That would help, wouldn't it? Just having the mic on. So let's start again. As you can see, this is my first live stream. Hopefully, you can now all hear me. So, just to very briefly introduce myself. My name is James Gleave, and welcome to this very first live stream of scenario planning for transport. And thank you all very much for sparing your time today to just come join me and to learn about the wonderful world of transport scenario planning. So the purpose of today is to give you all a very brief introduction into what scenario planning is all about, how it's then applied to transport, how and also just some useful tools and techniques which I use in order to make scenario planning become something which is very routine and something which you can also apply yourself as well. So I just want to check that the the quality of the stream, and it's going to sound really strange. I noticed that there are a few of you. On the stream at the moment. And a few of you have already been commenting in the live chat to the right hand side. So I'd really like to know where you're actually all calling in from. So if you're just able to go to quickly type your city or your country which you're tuning in from, then that'll be absolutely brilliant and incredibly fascinating. For those of you who don't know, from obviously my home, as you can see, it's absolutely lovely here, and my home is in Bedfordshire in the UK, and obviously I'm just like everybody else, just tuning in from home, and just having to deal with what is actually a really quite descriptive change, I think you'll probably believe. Also, we've already got a few. So, hi, Esoterics from Bristol. Is that Martin from West Mids? Oh, hi, Nick from Wokingham. Oh, got hi, Ali from Tehran, Rui from Porto, in Portugal. Great to see we have an international audience here. Oh, Manchester, the Wirral, London as well. A couple of people from London. So, from the looks of the line outside, some railway line outside my window, seems to still be trains running through London. So, obviously, nothing's completely shut down. So, okay. So, Goldamy as well. Thank you very much. So the way this is going to work is I'm showing you some good practice examples. I'll just keep talking a lot, but please submit your comments in the live chat. I'll try and deal with them as we go through the presentation, so feel free to comment at absolutely any time. So without further ado, I'm going to go to the presentation, and hopefully you should all be able to see the lovely PowerPoint presentation which I've prepared for you. As I said, this is going to go over some very basic concepts. So obviously the most simplistic one really is, why do you actually think about the future? And I've just put up a couple of good examples here of actually why you think about the future in transport. So the obvious thing is, in transport we build stuff and we build it to last a long time. So just down the road from me there is a road which has been around since the time of the Romans, for instance. And also in transport planning, we often build based upon 60-year return on investment cycles. Even for trains, you're talking about 30 years return on investment. So it should be in our very nature to think in the long term. But also, and I think much more pertinent right now, is our future assumptions will always be challenged. And a really good example which I want you all to think of right now is, think back to 2 weeks ago and think back to what certainties you had about 2 weeks ago. You thought, okay, I'll still be able to go to work, the kids will still be able to go to school. All of that's changed now. And the future has a really good habit of challenging our assumptions as to what it's going to be like. And so, whilst we often try and think in terms of a forecast and think in terms of certainty, actually how the future pans out is usually something which is very different to the way we think about it. So we need to think about the future in a different way. Because if you don't, stuff like this happens. And I always like to start with this. It's like a couple of really funny predictions, which look on reflection to be absolutely stupid, but then perhaps not so for a reason which I'll say. So this is a really good one, very pertinent to transport. President of the Michigan Savings Bank advising people to not invest in the Ford Motor Company. So the horse is here to stay, but automobile is only a novelty, a fad. Yeah, obviously that didn't turn out in the way which they thought it would. Another really good one is, of course, President of the Western Union. In a letter to Alexander Graham Bell, this telephone has too many shortcomings to be seriously considered as a means of communication. It's amazing how in the last few weeks we're suddenly rediscovering this thing called a telephone. We're suddenly rediscovering the thing that this thing which we have in our pocket here. We're not just surfing the internet with it or checking emails. We're actually using it to call people and do those sorts of things. Now, of course, on reflection, things are really silly and predictions didn't come true. But you've got to think about it within the context of the time. So take this, for example, the prediction on Alexander Graham Bell's telephone. At the time, Western Union had a very good management courier system and a very good system of messaging. So it was really hard to think about the sort of disruptive change which this telephone would create. And so when your business is then based upon that certainty that this massive disruption cannot happen or will not happen, inevitably it will happen. But it still comes from a very understandable place that we base our future certainty upon. So, and that is why scenario planning is really important in breaking away from our dominant mindset of how we think about the future, and not just thinking of the future in terms of predictions, but thinking of the future in terms of in terms of what could be and what future worlds there could be. So there are lots of different websites out there, and there are lots of different advisors who advise you on how to do scenario planning, how to do strategy, what's the best way to do it. They'll come up with all sorts of methodologies, all sorts of frameworks. And to be honest, I'm not going to recommend a particular one to you. The one which I've shown here is the one from the Sustainable Urban Mobility Plans work done by Polis and from some of our European partners to develop new urban mobility plans. But the most important thing which I want you all to take away is, regardless of the methodology which you use, regardless of the approach which you use, scenario planning and strategy is a process. It's not a project. Very often in transport, we approach it like a project. We approach it like this is something to do because we've got to adopt a strategy, or we've got to adopt a policy, and we've got to do it by this date. Once we've done it, the date the policy's adopted, there we go. We just let it go. But actually, scenario planning and strategy is an ongoing process, and it's something of constant learning. It's something of constant iteration. And scenario plan and undertaking scenarios themselves can be undertaken at any time. They can be refreshed at any time. So as it says here, producing a future world is an occasional activity, but identifying which ones are actually coming to pass is ongoing. And if you don't come away from this presentation with anything else, it is you've got to establish scenario planning as a process, as opposed to something which is something which you do in the one-off. So how do you kickstart it all? I mean, you can just write a scenario tomorrow, right? Well, yeah, you could, and believe me, I've seen people who've done that. Whether or not it's any good is another thing entirely. So what I'm going to go into now is I'm going to show you a few tools which will set you up to do a really good scenario planning exercise. And so you first of all start with a question which you want asking about the future. And you must do it. Because if you're not careful, scenario planning can lead you in all sorts of directions, and you can explore the future in all sorts of different ways. Whilst that's incredibly fun and very interesting, particularly for me, it won't result in anything meaningful, and it won't result in an output which you can then use. And so you must start with a focal question. So what this then does, this identifies a focal area or issue for you to explore, such a decision or a question that is critical for your future of your organisation right now. But most importantly, you need to choose a year. You need to choose an endpoint for your work. So let's say, for example, if you ask a question about what is the future of mobility as a service? That's a pretty reasonable question. It narrows the exploration somewhat, but it's still not good enough. So what you could ask instead is, how will mobility as a service play out up until the year 2025? So what that then does, and the way which you then change that question, and the way which you've actually provided an endpoint, you've provided much more clarity, is it still gives scope for you to explore it, but it also gives you gives you something to aim for, and it gives you something to look at. Again, gives you something to gives you something to look at, gives you something to focus upon. And so it then provides a much more focus to your work. And it's really important that you get this focal question right at the start, because all of your consequent work will be driven by this question. So the next step is you then actually start to do something which is called horizon scanning. Now, I know of no project, no scenario planning piece of work, no strategy team which is successful who does not do horizon scanning on a constant basis. So this is where you are trying to, basically you're looking at the horizon, and you're trying to constantly collect data, you're trying to constantly process insight and analyze intelligence, which is of relevance to your organization and relevant to your focus question. It can cover a variety of sources, and it looks what we call weak signals of change. Now, you're probably thinking at this point, well, okay, James, how do I then detect a weak signal of change? And because it's very easy to identify at an early stage identify at an early stage what everybody's talking about. It's less easy to discover the weak stuff. I'll be honest, I've never come up with a magic formula to identify that. It's something which can really come from experience, something which you reflect and look back on, and you think, well, okay, this particular signal here identified this change, identified something much more meaningful was going on. But it also then looks at changes that could happen on all time horizons. So it's not just something which looks at the here and now, and it doesn't look at just what's going on right now, but it looks at stuff which is happening, which could happen in the medium and the long term. And so how do you then do this? So you're thinking, well, okay, I can't read the news a lot. I read all these different industry sources. I look at websites. I'm constantly reading. How do I then put up with something meaningful? And the most important thing which you must do is you should set up a process. So what I'm going to demonstrate here, show here, hopefully once it actually works. So no, it's not working, which is kind of typical, really. Okay. See, this is the great thing about live streams, isn't it? They never work when you want them to. Okay, so just bear with me one moment. Hopefully this should now work. I'm hoping it will do. Tell you what, hang on, we'll go back to this. Okay, nope, that's not worked. Difficult. Okay, here we go. Hopefully you should all be able to see that. I'm hoping you'll be able to anyway. So, I'm hoping you'll be able to see that. Yes, excellent, excellent. So, what I've established here, and it's something for which a link is provided in the description, is a horizon scanning monthly checklist. And what this is intended to do is to set you up on a good habit, which will, this is a good set of habits to establish a process for actually bringing this insight, which no doubt you're all collecting, and no doubt you're all collecting together in any case, and actually putting it into something meaningful. So the link to this is provided in the description, and you can download it. It's downloadable as a Word document. So what is actually scenario? So what horizon scanning does is it takes all this information which you're constantly collecting, you're constantly reading about, and tries to put it into something meaningful. So obviously the essential preparation is you actually need to identify the focus and the themes, the scan for the month ahead. You need to identify who's leading the process, set up a shared folder, and do some really kind of basic, basic stuff to, basic. This is some basic things which you can do to collect together your evidence, and it provides your entire team with a good evidence base. So, the things which you must do daily is firstly gather the intelligence from different sources. You should organise it in accordance with the themes which you agreed at the start of your scan, and share what you find with others and ask for their opinion upon it. It's seldom a good scenario planning exercise, which very seldom a good scenario planning exercise which just relies upon the view of one person or the view of even just two people. If you're able to, say, share what you find with others and get their views on it, it's absolutely fantastic. What I often then do is have a weekly team scanning meeting of less than an hour, ask a few key questions, and identify a time horizon of the impact of this on this particular insight. And what you can then do is you can then assign a score reflecting the impact and the likelihood of this particular bit of insight happening. So let's say you identify something in your horizon scanning about obesity is a growing crisis in the obesity is a growing problem. You might identify actually that's a high impact, high certainty of it actually happening. And what you can then do is you can then map each insight on an impact matrix, impact time horizon matrix. So again, I've got an example here of an impact timescale matrix which you can use, where on the vertical axis you put a score for the impact and the likelihood of that happening, and then on the horizontal axis you identify a time horizon. So in usual Blue Peter fashion, here's one I made earlier. So on here, I identified a few key drivers and a few key bits of insight as part of a project which I did for the Ministry of Defence. Now, this is not all which we identified, but it was just some evidence of it. So we identified there was increasing local trips by all modes. We identified as increasing traffic congestion, and what we just did is we just mapped them in accordance to what we thought they were happening and the time horizon of them happening. Now, typically a good horizon scanning project would just be full of these, which is obviously a very good thing because it then provides you with then the intelligence. But it's a really good way of visualizing your thinking. And then what you then do is, at the end of the month, is you hold a monthly insights workshop and you try and cluster these different insights together. And then you have a discussion as to what are the risks, what are the opportunities of these happening, identify what might be done, and then what evidence needs filling, and what you then do about it. And you just host a discussion, a workshop, try and bring in as many different people as you can into this process in order to make it something which is meaningful and be able to translate all of this data which you've been collecting into some meaningful action. Okay, so what I'm now going to do is I'm going to go back to the presentation. So the way which you can then summarize this is you scan daily, you prioritize what the most important stuff is weekly, and then you analyze it on a monthly basis. And it's just a really good way of structuring the insight which you collect. But the most important thing here when it comes to horizon scanning is that you scan for, you look beyond the superficial. It's very easy to just kind of look at everything and think, oh my God, there's like so much which is going on, and this particular thought leader over here is talking about autonomous cars. This particular thought leader over here is talking about mobility as a service. Those are clearly the most important things. And those would be identified as really good news items here at the top. But it's only over time you then start to identify, well, okay, what are the things that are reoccurring? What are the things which are actually driving these sorts of things? And how does it then tune into something which is much more meaningful, much deeper about mindsets and about the way which we live our lives and the way which we then see the world. And that's when horizon scanning really comes into its own, because over a period of time you can identify what the most important things are, but also you can understand where they're actually coming from, and also the perspectives of people who are talking about them, how different peoples then see them, and you understand their meaning on a much more deeper level. And once you get to that point, horizon scanning becomes an incredibly powerful tool for you to start futuring. So the only other hints which I'll give you at this point is, first of all, you make it a habit constantly. It's not something which you can do as a one-off. Widen your sources when you do scan, but trust the verifiable ones. Scans are by their nature, but it's always worthwhile thinking, well, can I trust this particular evidence here? What I've also identified as an RSS feed reader is a godsend, because, as you know, there's a lot of news going on and there's a lot of publications which are provided. Particularly statistics publications. I'm subscribed to the RSS feed of the Office of National Statistics here in the UK, and they publish a lot, basically. But it's a really good way of organising some of your feeds, organising some of the stuff to come in, and the really good feed readers, which I use a feed reader called Feedly, they actually organise it for you, and they organise it into something meaningful and presentable, which is You'll thank me if you subscribe to them. And then you mentioned ask the views of others. So okay, you started scanning. You've started, identifying lots of different news sources. You're getting lots of different information. You've identified your kind of what are the recurring themes, and it's going well. So from that good systemic scanning can identify what the drivers of change are. So these are the things which are constantly coming up. They are things which are constantly repeating. They are constantly, they're constantly repeating. They're constantly coming up, and they are just key drivers of change, which are driving one or more different trends. So some drivers, what they then tend to do is they tend to coalesce with one another. and they tend to coalesce in a way which forms a trend. Also, drivers can be trends in their own, and drivers can also then be uncertainties. And what's more, different trends can then combine with one another to form megatrends. Now, I've just thrown out there a lot of different terms, and you're probably thinking, what on earth's he on about? And I do not blame you either. So when I first started this scenario planning and scanning, best part of 10, 15 years ago, I constantly got confused about these different terms: drivers, trends, megatrends, and uncertainties. So I've prepared a little slide here, which hopefully gives you a bit of an understanding as to what they are. So a driver is the fuel behind a change taking place. So let's take, for example, increasing levels of obesity. A driver behind increasing levels of obesity is higher levels of inactivity. So higher levels of inactivity is a driver of increasing levels of obesity. That's hopefully giving you a good example. A trend itself can also be made up of more than one driver. So, and this is what you typically find that, and it kind of goes back to the point which I've visualized here about how different drivers, which are related to one another and come linked in some way, can come together to form a specific trend and one driver. And so how you then present that trend becomes, so you present that trend in a different way as you would to a driver. And a megatrend can be made up of more than one trend. So this one really gets stark complicated. And the most important thing of all, which we'll come on to later, is what an uncertainty is. And it's also the most complicated, which is not helpful. So an uncertainty can be both the outcome of a driver, or it can be a driver itself. So let's take, for example, changing levels of car ownership in the UK. So that can be an uncertainty. We do not know how it's going to change in the future, and it could have a major impact. But also, the outcomes of that changing levels of car ownership, which may be, say, increasing levels of public transport use, increasing levels of walking and cycling, those can also be uncertainties as well. Again, it's an extremely complicated thing, but the most important thing to think about at this point is, as I said, am I thinking of the outcome or am I thinking of the driver in itself? And so what you can then do, I'll start again on that one. So in terms of then how you then evidence the future, there are different ways by which you can evidence whether or not something is a trend, whether or not something is an uncertainty, whether or not something is a driver, but also whether or not a trend or a driver is actually occurring. And we have a problem with the future in that you can't evidence something which hasn't happened yet. Really tricky to do. So, the way in which we typically do it is we do something called transport modelling forecasts. Here I show on the screen a good example from Professor Phil Goodwin of how the Department for Transport forecasts of actual car traffic growth have actually related to reality. So obviously you'll see the forecast heading upwards and reality actually then leading into kind of going on a flat line. So it's very important when you do forecasts, you actually understand what are the most important factors which are driving these particular forecasts, which I'll come on to later. So you can also then survey experts in the field. You can get their perspective on what the future may hold. You can also understand the scientific basis of how what you're interested in relates to other drivers. So there are very few truths, I suppose, when it comes to futuring, but there are certain certainties which basically science dictates are going to happen. So, extreme example here, you can't do something which breaks laws of gravity, for instance. You can't, so you can't like break fundamental rules of science, I suppose. So, but understanding the scientific basis of how things are related to one another and whether or not something is a scientific certainty is also very good for evidencing what the future is about. I've also shown up here a few useful resources actually to get you started on evidencing the future. So I've mentioned the DFT's road traffic forecasts, for instance. The Government Office for Science has a lot of good foresight projects. The one which I'd actually recommend the most is the one at the top, the CIA's World Fact Book. Perhaps it's not surprising that they know a lot about the world, but it's actually a really good compendium of the different changes which are happening across the world, what the current situation is, and it's presented in a really accessible format. So I would highly recommend having a look at the World Fact Book. As well as, obviously, I have a few examples here around transport, like the International Transport Forum, for instance. Those are just some useful sources which I find very useful. Okay, so you got together all your drivers, you've done all your horizon scanning, you're bringing together your drivers. Now what you've got to do is write up your trends. And for this, you use a trend card. And fortunately, yet again, I do have an example of a trend card. Again, the link to this is provided below in the description. So I'm hoping you'll also be able to see this. So this is a very simple trend card. And what you then do is you collect together all of your evidence, you collect together all your evidence on your drivers, what the impacts could be, and then you just describe this trend. So you describe what's going to happen, you provide the links to the evidence, you also provide a counter trend as well. I also find this is a very useful activity. So if you find there's another trend which is happening which conflicts with it, it's worthwhile noting it here. You identify what the drivers are, who the main actors are, so is it national government, local government. You identify what potential future this trend could then lead to, and what the consequences are, as well as then your reference as well. And this is a really useful way of bringing together your insight and making it accessible. So I'm hoping you will now be able to see a couple of examples which are actually on the template which is provided and which you can download completely for free, by the way. So again, this is some work which I did for the UK Ministry of Defence. And this is a couple of examples. So here, when it comes to awareness of poor air quality is increasing. So what I described was impacts of poor air quality. What the evidence was around, say, things like air quality management areas, what's happening counter to it, what's actually then driving it. So in this case, it is road traffic levels and levels of traffic congestion, as well as these and the references associated with this. And I also did this for people who were walking more frequently, more often as well. So hopefully those will be really good practical examples which you can then follow in order to produce your own trends. So implementation again. Okay, so yeah, what I've just summarised there in that little example there is, describe your trend, provide the evidence of it, write down the drivers, write down what will probably happen and what the consequences are. And what the result is, you get a lot of trend cards. There's no real hard and fast law on what is maximum, what's the minimum. It's just write as many trends as you feel is relevant. So once you've then all done that, You've done all that preparation work, and it's important that you do all that preparation work. You then actually get into the process of writing scenarios. And what a scenario is means different things to different people. I've put up here on the screen a few examples of how people define scenarios. And in a sense, how you see a scenario depends upon basically depends upon the context within which you're actually doing it as well. So some of them talk about business environments, some of them talk about strategic planning, some of them talk about organizational change. So I'm going to put in my own definition and the own way in which I see it. Fundamentally, scenarios are stories of the future. They have component parts, they have drivers, trends, and uncertainties, which we've covered, and it's usually communicated by way of a narrative, and you bring in qualitative and quantitative methods to describe the future in a way which is relevant to your target audience. And also, I'll add to this, relevant to your focal question at the start. So, as you can probably see, it's narrative based. It is something which is based upon numbers, but is not driven by numbers. And it's very important that we as transport planners see this, because a lot of future scenarios work which we undertake are actually driven by these numbers, and they're driven by certainties, let's say, over traffic chaos or overcrowding on public transport, when actually what scenario planning done well is it tells us of the future. So as I said, scenarios are narrative based. They must add to the narrative, numbers must add to the narrative, but they must not drive it. You must not just say, let's say for example, in the future traffic congestion will increase by 50%, and then that's it. They are based as much on engagement as they are on cold, hard analytics. So you constantly talk with people about what the future could hold. You engage them in scenario planning workshops, and you engage them to provide their thoughts and their feelings on the future as much as you do the cold, hard numbers. And the last point, which is the most critical and the one which people most fail on, is there is no good, bad, right or wrong scenario. There are so many times where people do a scenario planning exercise or they present the results of it and people say, oh, I don't want that scenario there, that's really bad. You know, that's completely wrong. What are you thinking about, you idiot? So, but the whole point is, these scenarios, there's no good or bad scenario. You may feel that there is a good or bad scenario, but there isn't one. It only tells a story of the future, and in some ways they are meant to provoke. So actually, how do you then go about creating them? As I said, you've got your evidence base together, you've got a team which is really fired up, wants to tell a story of the future. Sorry, I just whacked the wardrobe next to me just there. So how do you then create it? You've probably seen something similar to these two. Something called an axes of uncertainty. 4 square scenarios, which are usually pretty reasonable for most scenario planning projects. But in order to do that, you need to identify what your axes of uncertainty are, as these form the basis of your scenario matrix. So in these couple of examples here, so the one, let's say on the bottom left, is the 2 axes are climate change and deployment. So the two axes of uncertainty are climate change and population. And as you can see, they've given 2 polar opposites of what basically how these different uncertainties could come about. And that then drives the narrative in the different scenarios. So what you do is you take the results of your horizon scanning and your trend work, and you identify which are your 2 big uncertainties. Again, just do this through discussion. Do this through group discussion, do this through workshops. It's really good. It's a really good way of engaging people in the future. So for each of these uncertainties, you identify a range of axes that give a diametrically opposed outcomes of that uncertainty coming to pass. And for both uncertainties, choose one axis, which will then take forward to create the scenarios. So, to use a couple of examples from Transport. A couple of examples which I've chosen here, completely at random, I have to say, are the adoption of autonomous cars and reaction to climate-related weather events. Perhaps I should have put the emergence of a virus, but, well, didn't know it at the time, did we? So, from the work which we undertook with the UK Ministry of Defence, we identified there's several axes which you can do this. So, what we did was a very simple axis, which was a widespread adoption or a specialised or widespread adoption of autonomous vehicles, or more specialised, whether it be in trucks, whether it be in fleet management, for instance. Or another axis which we identified is the ownership model. So whether or not it went for fleet first or whether it went for private ownership first. Reaction to climate-related weather events, we actually only came up with one axis. So we identified there's an adaptation reaction and a retreat reaction. So does the general population adapt to climate change and the more severe weather events, or do we then actually retreat from vulnerable areas? You identify these axes through discussion, through a structured discussion with your team, with outside people. You can do it through workshops, obviously online now, but basically, so long as you come to some sort of degree of consensus as to which ones are your most important. And again, what I have done is identify. Okay, so again, I'm just trying to get the screen up. This is lovely. Okay, so this is great. Okay, so again, we've got a really nice scenario template for you to use, which you can just then download and use however you want. I recommend on this one you print it out large scale, or you can put it in a shared Google Doc or in a shared PowerPoint presentation and just use it to go and create notes all over the place. So, but yeah, it's there for you to use should you then wish to do so. Okay, so back to the presentation once again. Nope, that's not it. There we go, that's the presentation. Okay, so then you get on to you've identified your 4 scenarios. You've identified identified 4 scenarios. You've got to then start writing your scenario narrative. So actually, before I go on to that, thank you, Paul. Yes, actually, so backcasting, that is a really good methodology. I do have some links to the Government Futures Toolkit in the Government Futures Toolkit in the description, which actually describes backcasting in more detail. I haven't got time in order to get into it there, but yes, it's an extremely useful tool, and thank you for raising it. Anyhow, so writing the scenario narrative. So firstly, this is where you get to be creative, and personally where I find it's the most fun. So you write your scenario title. More provocative, the better. Obviously, don't be insulting. I mean, don't want to annoy your client, do you? But yeah, make it provocative, make people think about it, make people interested. You write down what your key drivers and your trends are that are most important to the scenario. You then write the story. You write a story, you try and paint a picture of a future world. You sprinkle in bits of data and you explain the scenario from the perspective of your audience, and consider and write down the implications of that scenario for your audience in terms of options available to them, all the different opportunities which are available to them in order to actually start to take action. And again, kind of what I've hopefully done for you all, because I'm incredibly nice, is again, the links provided in the description, is a template for a scenario narrative. So template for producing a scenario description. It also then contains some links for some hints and tips for what you should then write in each individual element. So what I'm particularly going to focus upon here is actually the scenario story. And because I know storytelling doesn't really come naturally to a lot. So these are just kind of a few helpful hints which I've found over the years, which have been really helpful to actually start thinking about and framing the story of the future. So firstly, you're going to relate it to the focal question. And sometimes you need to do that explicitly for people. So people may think, well, actually, how does the scenario relate to what we asked them to start doing 3 or 4 months ago? Even if you have to make that explicit, make the explicit link, you do it. It then makes it much more easy to digest. You write in a language and use terms your intended target audience will understand. When it comes to engaging with the public, you have to be very careful in how you do this, because we can often get stuck into writing in technical language. It's just the way we do things. So, also try to tell the story visually. Use graphs, pictures, icons, anything that adds to the narrative. Understand pictures much better. Be emotional and provocative in your language, but also be professional in your approach as well. So don't say something like, "Oh my god, this scenario is absolutely blooming awful," or this has happened. It was really absolutely awful, devastating. Try and balance provocation and professionalism. You can sometimes tell it from the perspective of the character, but personally, I would generally advise against doing that because it then puts a particular slant on the future, and you don't really want to do that. Keep it as brief as you can. I would certainly recommend not going for more than 1,500 words. Anything more than that, and people really start to get bored by it, quite frankly. So, yeah, it's just not worth doing. Okay, so before I actually show a couple of examples, I'll provide like a couple of thoughts on the role of things like traffic forecasts and modelling. So you can use the existing forecasts. So the Department for Transport produces road traffic forecasts every couple of years or so to inform their strategic thinking, and you can use the key drivers behind them as evidence in horizon scanning. And also, if you run models about basically about what your local network could look like, that can still be used as evidence, so long as you understand what the limitations, the positives and the negatives of your model are, or you can use them to test what the impacts of different scenarios would be on travel demand and refine those scenarios. So to use an example, if you identify in a particular scenario that this will lead to significant population growth, you can then test what that will then mean in the model, and then you can use the results from that model output to actually help you refine your thinking about what the scenario could then look like, how you can then change the different narrative. Personally, I prefer this approach because it really plays to the strength of traffic models, and it really plays to the strength of traffic forecasts, in that they enable you to test different ways of exploring the future and testing different scenarios. And so you shouldn't just rely upon evidence, but help you to refine your thinking. But again, going back to what I said earlier on, do not use it as a way of driving what your scenario is. So what then makes for a good scenario is, firstly, it must be internally consistent. You really have to check the scenario narrative, and you really have to check the evidence that things are not conflicting with one another. So, for example, if use the previous example of if you have a massive population growth and there's a reduction in traffic on the roads, you have to kind of question the consistency of that. So you just constantly have to check things. Any numbers present should be validated or provided by a reputable source. They are driven by a number of drivers, but very importantly, they act as a constructive challenge to conventional thinking. Because, as I mentioned at the very start, we think in terms of forecasts, we don't think in terms of scenarios. And so, what scenarios do when they're at their best is they act as a constructive challenge to what that conventional thinking is. And thankfully, what you do have is you have lots of really good examples out there as to scenario planning work and scenario work which has done this really successfully over the years. So the first good example, and these are the masters of scenario planning, are from Shell. So they became very famous in the 1970s for their scenario planning work, and it's still really top-notch work. So what you can then do is you can log onto their website, again, link provided in the description, to explore their different scenarios and to look at the evidence behind it. So I'm looking at the Sky scenario, they provide videos on it, and what they're really good at is telling the story of the scenario. And they are really good at discussing what its implications should be. And also they allow you to explore it. So yeah, they have the webinars, they have interactive data tools, the numbers behind it, they share it all. It's absolutely really top-notch work, and they're basically the leaders in scenario planning. Looking back more closely to transport and mobility, of course, the UK Department for UK Government Office for Science recently completed a future of mobility study. Many of you have probably already read it, but it's a really good example of getting to the point on what these scenarios will actually mean for policy making and for the sorts of decisions which we then have to make. So they put it out so they publish it in a really clear, really easily digestible way. It's a very fun. It's actually a very fun read, quite frankly. Regardless of what you think about the future, they're very visual, and there's lots and lots of evidence. And again, all the evidence which you can explore as well. It's a meaty tome, I'll be honest, but it's still really good piece of work. And then the final piece of work which I want to show you is a path towards one done by the European Commission on paths towards a sustainable EU economy. So again, this is a really kind of comprehensive piece of work, but one thing which these guys do really well is they get into the detail of scenario, and they get into not only is kind of the evidence base really good, but they actually explain the detail behind what this then matters, what the key messages are, how thinking then needs to change in a really positive, really engaging way. These are just a few examples which I can think of, and these are just a few. I mean, you look on the internet and you do a search, and you can find absolutely hundreds of different pieces of work. If you can find pieces of work which already then have the data published, it's absolutely brilliant, absolute goldmine. I highly recommend that you go and have a look for yourself. And it comes an example of how you then write different scenarios as well. So, okay, right, let's go back to the presentation. And so that's kind of really trying to do scenario planning in an hour, which is extremely difficult, and as you can probably see, covers a lot of different areas. But hopefully I've given you some really good insight, really good introduction. So there's kind of a few final words of advice. After I've provided these, by the way, I'd really appreciate if you perhaps stick around for a couple of minutes so I can share what Mobility Lab is doing. So, and these words of advice come from experience. So firstly, you make exploring the future a habit. It's not something which you can just pick up and just drop and pick up and drop, although it's really easy to, bearing in mind there's day-to-day issues, particularly now of all times. But making that exploration of the future a habit really refines your scenario planning, really refines your future exploration skills. Talk to engage and talk to as many people as possible. That's a really good way of challenging your thinking, and it's a really good way of challenging kind of the way which things are done, challenging, and also providing you with additional insight into your work. You always remember the focal question. And then the final thing is have fun. Be creative with it. It's a fun activity. It kind of, scenario planning done well is an incredibly engaging activity, and it really gets people excited about the future. And so, yeah, just kind of have a load of fun with it. Just make it a team activity. I can't really say much more, to be honest. Just have fun. Be creative. It's your excuse to be creative. Heaven knows, as transport professionals, we're very logical, we're very operational focused, when actually what we should be doing is thinking much more creatively. And scenario planning is a really good way of doing this. So that's kind of all the lecture bit, I suppose. But before you go, there's a couple of things which I want to make you aware that Mobility Lab is doing. So, firstly, if you like this and you thought this was insightful, we do provide dedicated, tailored online scenario planning training. So, as well as going into lots of this in more detail, we also explore concepts like causal layered analysis, and go into this in kind of much more detail. But this scenario planning training can then be tailored for your teams. It can be tailored for tailored for your organisation. And if you just want to find out more about it, then please come follow the link to more info in the description or log on to our website. You can also kickstart your work using something which we call the rapid fire trend analysis. So we've obviously undertake trend analysis constantly. We're kind of currently building a currently refreshing our pitch deck. Trends deck. But what we are able to offer is a rapid fire trend analysis whereby you can go from initial inquiry to your own tailored report inside a week or so. And boy, bearing in mind the way things are changing at the moment, you kind of need that sort of insight pretty quickly. So what we are able to offer is you contact us, you drop us an email, and you say we can then set up a free 30-minute to an hour consultation on what your requirements are, and then we can then discuss it. So yeah, that's kind of all the sorts of things which Mobility Lab are kind of are offering. So the only thing which I can now say is thank you all very much for being part of this very first live stream. I've loved actually seeing your comments in the chat, and yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking to you all, and I hope that you have kind of a very pleasant day, and most importantly, you guys all stay safe and carry on exploring the future. So thank you.